Madam Secretary, welcome to Book TV. You've had a great month. A birthday, weeks on the bestseller list, which is every author's dream, and the Medal of Freedom from President Obama. Congratulations.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to do this with you, Anne, a good friend.
Thank you. Let's talk about Prague winter. You were 59 years old, just being sworn in, when you learned that your parents had been born Jewish and that some of members of your family had been killed in the Holocaust. You answered a lot of questions. You dealt with it. It was a painful period. What made you go back to it and write a whole book on the subject?
Well, because I didn't think I had all the answers. And let me just explain a little bit of the context of how this happened. When I was ambassador at the United Nations was when people started writing me letters. I hadn't really been a public figure till then, and some of the people asked for money or visas. And then there were letters that would say something about the village that my parents were born in or dates, but everything was wrong in them. There never was a letter that had all the facts. And I mean, somebody saying that they'd gone to high school with my father in 1915, which would have been impossible because he was born in 1909. But in November 96, when I was being vetted to be Secretary of State, I all of a sudden got a letter from somebody that had all the facts in it, the names right, the dates, etc. And it was just when I was being vetted to be Secretary, and I was in the White House counsel's office, and they asked me kind of the normal questions like had I paid my taxes and did I have a nanny and things like that. And then at the end they said, are there anything that we skipped or is there anything that we should have asked that you might want to tell us? And I said, well, look, there's a real possibility that I'm of Jewish background. And they said, so what? The president is not anti-Semitic. So over the holidays, I talked to my daughters and explained what the possibilities were. They were obviously fascinated. They already thought their grandparents were interesting and complicated. And that was that. And then Michael Dobbs, whom I think you probably know, a reporter on the Washington Post, wanted to do a profile of me. But you're not allowed to talk to the press between the time that you are named and the time you're confirmed. So my office gave him names of various people in Europe that he could talk to. And on the day that I was confirmed, he came into my office and started presenting me with documents, those horrible cards. The Nazis were very efficient, and they had cards that explained what transport somebody had been put on, where they died, and then some photographs. And they said, you do know that many members of your family died in the Holocaust. I mean, it's one thing to find out you're Jewish, it's another to find out. I was appalled, horrified, stunned. And the only way I can describe it, Anne, is it's now hard to believe, but I was the first woman Secretary of State, and there really were questions as to whether a woman could be Secretary of State. And so the way to describe it was I had been asked to represent my country in a marathon, the first time a woman ever had been, and given a very heavy package to unwrap as I ran. So the only thing I could do at the time was ask my brother and sister to go to the Czech Republic to begin to try to put the story together. And they did. But I felt that there was more to find out, and I wanted to kind of expand, not only to find out about the Jewish part of it, but to really look at my parents' personal story, which is the core of this book. I talk about it kind of in three layers. The inner core is their story. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we'll talk about that and the various things that he did. And he came, they were very young when all this happened, so I wanted to write about them. And then the second layer was to put it into the context of most amazing period in history, world history, 1937 to 48. How did the Second World War start? What were negotiations like? What were the things that were really going on? And then the third layer is probably the most complicated because it's about the difficulty of making decisions, personal as well as professional, how people behave when they're put in very tough positions, how much of any human being is good and helpful and how much a little bit of a collaborator or traitor is in everybody. So that's kind of the way I constructed the book.
Well, the theme of choice that goes throughout the book I found really fascinating. What individual choices that people make and what choices individuals make for countries and how it influences them. It's just a great theme throughout. You were born in Prague in 1937. Your parents went back to Prague a couple of years later when everything was unraveling and the Nazis were coming in, and your parents escaped with you to England. Tell us about your mother's letter and what you learned about that escape.
Well, what happened, and just to give a little bit more context to that, what happened was my father, already in the diplomatic service, his job had been to be press attaché in Belgrade. My mother wanted me to be born in Prague, where her mother was, and so I was born in Prague, and then we went back to Belgrade. And then my father was recalled in 1938, and he was in Czechoslovakia when the Nazis marched in on March 15th, 1939. And my mother, I found kind of a yellow pad where she was describing, my father died sometime before, and she wanted to tell people about who he was, and so she wrote something. The whole family was surprised because my mother never wrote anything that we could tell in this, and she had her own English style, and so it was interesting to find this yellow pad.
And tell us about what she said about the escape.
Well, what she said was that we were living in Prague. My father had gone to see whether he could get a stamp on a passport to get out, and they had generally been hiding and kind of not going anywhere. They had sent me to be with my grandmother in a little town outside of Prague called Poděbrady, and while my mother kind of sat in cafes and tried to figure out. She wrote in that my father had kind of gone around, and with a little bit of bribery, they had managed actually to get a stamp to get out. And then they got my grandmother to bring me into Prague, and everybody just had one suitcase, and they got on a train to get out. And as she said, that was the last time they ever saw any members of their family. So it was accidental in many ways.
A terrible choice for your parents to have to make, whether to stay in Czechoslovakia with their family or to leave and save their daughter as well as themselves. Yeah. Did they ever talk to you about that choice?
Never. And that is part of the whole difficulty of the story, is that I never had a lot of these discussions with them. What I think, and an awful lot of this book is speculation, and that is that nobody imagined that things would be as terrible as they were, as they became, the barbarity of the Nazis and all the things. And also the other part that I put myself back into, they were very young. My mother was 29 and my father was 30. And what I believe from knowing them and knowing especially my father was, they were a great generation, Anne, because Czechoslovakia was a new country. It had begun in 1918. It was a democratic country. My father was very much a supporter of that democracy and a young diplomat, and they knew that they were going to try to set up a government in exile in London and try to figure out how to get their country back. And so it was kind of not just to save me, but a patriotic move, I think, to be with those who wanted to take their country back. I also do think, and again, speculation, that nobody imagined that everybody would be dead, that they would never see them again, that, they would not have a chance to come back.
Your father was in charge of the BBC, of the broadcast that went over the BBC with news back to Czechoslovakia. Tell us about those broadcasts.
Well, what happened, first of all, they did set up a government in exile in the end. And one of the things that they needed to do was to try to keep up the spirits of the people that had stayed, the resistance fighters, and to tell them that people in England cared about them, how important it was. And so the broadcasts were basically, some of it was just flat out news, telling them what was going on. The other was to keep them, I think, inspired about the fact that this would end and that people were thinking of them. And I had an opportunity with Bill Woodward, who really helped me a lot on this book, is to look at some of the recordings that they had made and the transcripts. And and basically explaining the horrors of what was going on, and that they were not forgotten. It was very much,